The rich don't even go broke the same as the rest of us, huh?
An interesting, if cryptic, response.
I'm a count, not a saint.
Have you ever experienced deja vu? I mean, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? It seems like history repeats itself. Well, maybe not exactly. I don't know about you, but from where I sit, it sure seems to rhyme. The funny thing is, when they tell you it's new, it's not. It's just been repackaged. How do you know? You just have to know where to look. Well, I'm looking. Hello and welcome. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, I'll switch on the lights. Come on in and join me, and we'll put some light on it on the Red Pill Diary. A telegram, official and secret, arrived a day earlier. Its instruction? Transfer the precious cargo to a small airport with the least possible delay. The DC-4 was a large 4-engine plane with seats for 50 passengers. Yet on this flight, it carried only a fraction of its potential payload, and it circled the airport, awaiting landing instructions. Its captain and the aircrew had locked themselves in the cockpit to avoid the unsightly commotion of the soldiers, as the khaki-beretted officer calmly smoked his pipe at the front of the plane. The plane eventually taxied to the cordoned portion of the tarmac near the military hangars. The cargo, precious, secreted into military vehicles, began the final leg of its journey in a single-file convoy, slipping into the darkness through the fence opening at the runway's end. During the rainy season, the sun sets at 6:45 p.m., so the cargo arrives before dark at the rural house on the way to its destination, only 45 minutes away, awaiting the remaining vehicles. Those vehicles arrive and join the convoy at 10 p.m. and begin the trek to deliver the cargo. It was the final stop, and waiting were 3 heavily armed squads of soldiers standing just outside a circle of cars, their headlights illuminating a large tree just off the side of the road. Only 201 days after the country's sovereignty, Patrice Lumumba was the last man standing just before 11 p.m. in Katanga, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. None of these men would return. It was January 17th, 1961. Now for the backstory. So let's start with the Congo. It was formerly known as either the Congo Free State or the Independent State of Congo. It's a large state, and it was an absolute monarchy in Central Africa from 1885 to 1908. At that time, it was privately owned by King Leopold II, and he happened to be the constitutional monarch for the Kingdom of Belgium. So essentially, Leopold seized this region by convincing the European states at the Berlin Conference on Africa in 1884 that he was involved in humanitarian and charitable work. You know, difficult to see that with the forced labor and the natural rubber harvested, which created an economic boon and about 70 million Belgian francs profit over about 6 years for the king, and all the other atrocities that went on in harvesting this rubber for market. And after 1900, this group called Société Générale practically controlled all the mining in the province of Katanga and Kasai through its mining interests. I'll just call it UMHK. Now, that's important because in 1915, the mining company discovered a deposit of what they used to call pitch blende. It's uraninite. It's other uranium minerals of higher grade than had ever been found anywhere in the world. So by the start of World War II, the mining companies constituted a state within the Belgian Congo. This country produces more than 3% of the world's copper and about half its cobalt, most of which comes from this province called Katanga. And why is cobalt important? Because cobalt is used in batteries, and we see batteries used now in what? Electric vehicles. 73% of all cobalt mined in the world comes from the Congo. So Belgium retained control of the colony until it gained independence as the Republic of the Congo on June 30th, 1960. Patrice Lumumba was elected as prime minister. His loyalty actually lay with the African people of the Congo and not necessarily the economic and the colonial interests of Belgium, meaning he saw the people over the mining profits of Société Générale and Belgium. And Belgium wasn't about to lose its mining gem in Katanga and South Kasai to Lumumba and the people of the Congo. So let's stop just for a second to say Now you can see where this is going. The Europeans, or the Belgians, were the minority. They had all the power because they had economic power. They had the control over the mines and the profits. And they had the legal system behind them. They had the education, the training to manage this country, and they had been doing so since the 1880s. The minority was controlling the majority. Now, Lumumba is all in for the people of the Congo. Now it gets interesting and dangerous. So the Belgian and the mining company saw Lumumba and his appeal to the Congolese as a threat to their economic and power base. And in response, they needed to find a way to get rid of Lumumba. And this started Operation Barracuda. So not only did Belgium and the mining company see Lumumba as a threat, the United States was concerned that Lumumba might be influenced negatively by the Soviet Union. This is 1960. So what was going on in 1960? In 1960, right in the middle of the Cold War, right after the Korean War, you see the United States and the Soviet Union ramping up. And what was the big mineral that was important during this period of time? Uranium. And the Congo had lots of uranium and copper, tin, and other vital minerals the West and the United States did not want anyone else to have. Okay, so now we have to stop and kind of get the cast of characters going forward, because there is a few of them. Now, some of these you're going to know from the episode 8. Others you're going to see in future episodes. So some of these names are going to be familiar because you're going to hear them again. The first two are Belgians. One is Harold d'Aspermont Linden. He's a noble family from Belgium, had been associated with the king for many, many, many years. Baron Robert Rothschild, also from a noble family from Belgium, and he's been connected to the king and finance, and of course, this mining interest in the Congo. They are the two that are primarily driving Operation Barracuda. So don't get hung up on all the names. There's going to be a lot of them, but they'll come back and you'll see them in different episodes. We've seen some in the past. We're going to see some now, and we're going to see them repeat in the future and around this time frame. So just bear with me. Don't make a big list. You don't have to have one. So the characters from the United States are Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, and President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, before we move on, we got to insert this piece of information because it's something we talked about before. Remember when I told you that political connections and family members are going to start to pop up and their relationships, and you don't really know that they exist until you look at them from a 30,000-foot level? Well, here's one example. Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, two brothers that were during this period of time in the 50s and 60s. Allen Dulles, who is the director of CIA, is related to, and is a nephew to, Eleanor Foster. Eleanor Foster is the wife of Robert Lansing. And Eleanor Foster also was a daughter of John Foster. Now, John Foster was a Secretary of State under Harrison in 1892. And he'll show up in another episode as it relates to Hawaii. Robert Lansing, of course, was the Secretary of State under Wilson. He wasn't the primary one. He was a secondary when William Jennings Bryan resigned and Robert Lansing was put in his place by Woodrow Wilson at the request of Elihu Root, who also had been a Secretary of State. As you can see, it's a small world. I can remember being in the military and going from base to base, and every time you went to a base, you'd find somebody you had worked for or they knew in a previous base. It is a small world, and it is a small world here, and they purposely keep it that way. Now, let me introduce you to one other character. His name is Sidney Gottlieb. Now, Sidney Gottlieb was a person who worked for the CIA under Dulles by the recommendation of a guy named Ira Baldwin and Richard Helms, and he worked out of Camp Detrick, Maryland. Camp Detrick, Maryland was where these bacteriologists from Nazi Germany were brought along with others who had performed experiments in Germany. Remember Operation Paperclip from the last episode? Well, here they were. Let's also enter another familiar character. His name is Dr. Walter Schreiber. Now, Dr. Walter Schreiber, as you remember or recall, he was the Surgeon General or the former Surgeon General for the Third Reich. And when Dr. Schreiber was secretly brought to America under Operation Paperclip, tied out to Allen Dulles, to work in the U.S. Air Force in Texas, his position was filled by another doctor. That doctor under the paperclip, Operation Paperclip, was none other than Dr. Kurt Blome. He was the former Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich and the man in charge of the Nazis' program to weaponize what? Bubonic plague. The activities on Camp King, now remember, Camp King was in Germany. It was where this Gehlen organization, or the Gehlen Org, they often called it just the Org. It was a German intelligence agency established in 1946 between the U.S. occupation authorities and the United States zone, post-war occupied Germany, and consisted of former members of the 12th Department of the German Army General Staff. It was headed by none other than Reinhard Gehlen, who had previously been the Wehrmacht's Major General and the head of the Nazi German military intelligence in the Eastern Front during World War II. Allen Dulles knew this Camp King was going because it was a black site. This was a secret place where they took Germans to prepare them to bring them to the United States. This agency actually was a precursor to what we see now, was formed in 1956, which is the German intelligence, so sort of like the German version of the CIA. Are you surprised? Because I was, to see these connections. As I started to do the research and reading, these names started to pop up. It seems to be overwhelming, but just bear with me. As we get through these episodes, you're going to be able to reflect back, say, I know that name, I've seen it before. So when it pops up in your research or your reading, you'll know where it came from. That's what's important, because then you can start seeing the connection because you remember the names from history. So you say, Lewis, what's this all got to do with the Hill of Beans? Well, remember, we brought people from Germany, scientists and engineers, to the United States to learn from their technology, knowing full well that that information and that data was derived from improper studies. People in Nuremberg were on trial for this conduct. They took this information and put it together with other scientists in the United States to advance that technology, advance that study or that information at further levels. So let's make the connection. CIA was using black sites to talk to doctors who had been involved in experiments in World War II Germany. They kept Camp King open as a black site to both interrogate and to learn from, and to also do experiments on people in Germany where they couldn't do it in the United States. And this was designed with the full knowledge of the CIA and experiments on individuals, sometimes without their knowledge, both in the United States and overseas at black sites, because they could not do it here. The point was to develop this so they could get information from the Soviets or Soviet agents, to get the information from them without them knowing it. These drugs were tested on those individuals they captured, and they were taken to these sites, these black sites, and interrogated there. There were rendition activities going on in those places, and they were also working on developing drugs just for this purpose. Now, this also included information about different types of bacteria, different types of diseases, and different ways to use those diseases to accomplish certain tasks, like poison somebody, also known as biological warfare. Okay, you say, good. But what's Gottlieb got to do with it? And here's the person who connects World War II, black sites, the CIA, bacterial studies, Lumumba, and the current trajectory of our intelligence communities. So the role of Sidney Gottlieb, he was trying to determine, because the United States was searching for a truth serum using different hallucinogenic drugs. Then it was LSD. This was part of what was known as Operation Bluebird, then Operation Artichoke, and then it became MK Ultra. So Gottlieb was involved during the end of World War II through the Cold War era and set the stage for what we see currently rising up in social media, the use of truth serum and drugs to change the psychological makeup of individuals. At least that allegations are there. And that's tied into the conduct of the CIA during the 60s and 70s. And we've seen it now and in the recent past. And you say, stop, that's a lot of information. So what's the tie between World War II, 60s Congo, and the assassination of Lumumba and the CIA? Well, here it is. The U.S. has been continuing to develop and perfect its quote-unquote tools since World War II with the information that they obtained from these former scientists that worked for Germany during the war. And so now they're continuing to develop these through these scientists in areas primarily around the world where there's less transparency. And these sites that are just buildings that you randomly find in the middle of cities and forests. For example, former black site near Vilnius, Lithuania, and it was known as Project Number 2 or Detention Site Violet. They have a former site in Romania, one in Bucharest, the other next to the Black Sea, code named Bright Light. They have a site or had a site in Poland. They called it Side Blue or codenamed Quartz. It was in a timber-framed red-roof 19th century villa in the forest of Poland. Now, this was a site used during the Second World War, with the Germans to use it as a SS intelligence center. After the war, it was listed on maps as a holiday resort, although it was a Soviet-run intelligence facility. And in 1968, guess who got it? We did. And they used it during the Prague Spring uprisings. The others we know of were Thailand, Egypt, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, which we know of, the island of Diego Garcia, and others. When were these located? Well, a lot of them were found out in the 2000s. But guess what? Our government had them going on before that because the Senate report, the church report, went to like 1,000 pages of the activities of the intelligence community. So they knew about these. And after 9/11, they sprang back up again. Some of them, they argued, were shut down, but they're still cropping up. So we know, both by history and present reality, that they exist. And that in these places, they're likely doing things, if history is any indication, of the things that they wouldn't want the rest of us to know about. So let me ask this question. Is it reasonable to have questions about whether these things are true or not? I mean, considering the historical occurrences. The answer, of course, is sure. So when we saw that church report that was published in 1976, detailing the activities of the intelligence community to discuss their findings, and what they saw was that there was a cooperation of this supposedly independent organization such as academia and the media, and in many ways they were aligned and protecting the clandestine organizations such as the CIA. Why? Because the average person believes or believed, because of the things that they were told, that they were helping. And in the 60s and 70s, they had an existential threat. At that time, in the Cold War, it was, you remember, I remember, communism and the Soviet bloc. Does that sound familiar? What was it in the 1990s and the 2000s? Who or what was the existential threat then? And what did the government and the clandestine organizations do? They opened up black site to do what? Interrogate who? Terrorists. That's why they found these black sites, is because they were taking them. They had rendition flights to these places. Well, you say, well, that's because of national security. Well, let's go back to Lumumba. So why was the West, including the United States, willing to actively pursue the elimination of Lumumba? He was just one person. He had the ability to unite the people, the majority, and take away the power and the control of the minority, the elites. That, to the West, was the existential threat. The United States was concerned that they would unite around him and they would become the majority. And they thought that the Soviet blocs would control them and they would lose the mining wealth. We're going to talk about this in the future because this is not the first time our government and other European governments or governments around the world have stepped in and created a scenario in order to protect some sort of financial interest. We'll see this again in future episodes. Who were all the existential threats to the European and the Congolese elites' power and the control? Lumumba was the focal point. With the help of co-opted, supposedly independent institutions, including the supposedly neutral United Nations force that went into the Congo at this time to, quote-unquote, protect him and the people of the Congo, they started smearing him. They vilified him. And they started to divide the people by any division possible. They created distractions, fear, confusion, and separation. They actually, the Katanga province separated, seceded. So they flood the subjects with propaganda. They limit the movement of the person and the conversation. during this period of time. It's all there. They ignite the emotions, the underlying struggles to divide, and lastly, they punish those who step out. That is what they did, including the U.S., or at least the U.S. proposed to eliminate him by using Gottlieb's poison that he had developed and put in a tube of toothpaste. Yes, you chuckle, but that's exactly what he had planned. So, but at least by the United States conduct, they condoned, either by inaction or passive assistance in the Congo, the activity against a single person. The U.S., our government, at that time was prepared to eliminate a person who was duly elected in a sovereign country. This won't be the first time we'll talk about this. It's not the last time they do it. But the Belgian nobility, they facilitated the capture through the arrest. And if you must read the reports about the unsightly demise of Lumumba, it's out there. So let's apply this today, or 2014, or even today. Do you see any use of supposedly independent institutions, academia, social media, the news media, the legal system? Do you see that being used negatively? Do you see any division? Do you see any confusion or problems created, or propaganda out there, things you just can't believe? You don't know where to go. You don't know what the truth is. So people are confused of what is really happening. Do you see that going on? Well, I do. Look back to 1960. What did that do? Who was the actual beneficiary of that? Who benefited? It wasn't the majority. It was the minority. The minority is afraid of an individual who rallies the majority to a common cause. We see this happen historically. We'll see it again. We've seen it before. Think of Romania in 1990. I was there. The majority stood up and Ceausescu was deposed. The majority has the power once it realizes it has the power. That is the existential threat to the elites and the establishment. And that was true then in 1960s Congo, and it's true now throughout the rest of the world and even here in our country. Do you know the best place to hide something or someone? Despite an ocean of information, if the truth is what we seek, and we must be willing to look, because many times it's hiding in plain sight. I'll leave the lights on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. You know, the more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward, because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving it that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.